I'm VJ Hamilton and welcome to the Autoimmune RESET, the place for you to learn how to thrive with autoimmune disease and feel empowered to take steps to transform your health to feel better than ever. You can start making changes today to improve your health. So with every episode, my mission is to share with you simple ways to up-level your diet and lifestyle with key learnings from my own journey reversing autoimmune disease and inspirational stories from those who have reset their autoimmune symptoms and are now thriving in life. I suffered from autoimmune disease for over 25 years and now I live symptom-free, and I wish the same for you as well. So thank you for being here and sharing this time with me. Now let's get started. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Autoimmune RESET podcast. I'm your host VJ Hamilton, I'm a nutritionist, scientist and expert in all autoimmune disease, and as always, thank you so much for joining me today. Today's episode is actually an update to one I recorded a couple of years ago on rheumatoid arthritis, and since then our understanding of autoimmune disease, particularly rheumatoid arthritis, has moved on enormously. The research into the gut microbiome has accelerated. We're learning more about how the immune system behaves long before symptoms develop, and perhaps most importantly, we're beginning to understand that rheumatoid arthritis isn't simply a disease that starts in the joints. For many years, rheumatoid arthritis was viewed as a disease of swollen joints, and I know when clients come to me, they will often come to me with a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, and because they are in so much pain with their joints. And we knew the immune system was attacking the lining of the joints, and understandably that's become the focus of treatments from a conventional medicine perspective as well. But over the last decade, and especially over the last 2 or 3 years, researchers have started asking different questions, and instead of asking why are the joints inflamed, they're asking what causes the immune system to become confused and dysfunctional in the first place. And that is a very different question. And it's one that I find incredibly exciting because it opens up so many more opportunities to support our health. And one of the things I do as a registered nutritionist and a functional medicine practitioner is to look at the root cause of somebody's symptoms. And that is how we're now viewing something like rheumatoid arthritis, which you would always just associate with the joints. But when I'm working with clients, they don't only come to me with swollen joints and pain, but they can have muscle pain, they can be fatigued, they can have issues going on with their skin. Now, before we go any further, I just want to make something very clear. Rheumatoid arthritis is a serious autoimmune disease. It can lead to irreversible joint damage, disability and complications affecting other organs if it isn't treated properly. And if you think you may have rheumatoid arthritis or you've been recently diagnosed, please don't delay seeking medical advice. And because we want to make sure that we prevent any irreversible damage, working with your doctor at the beginning is absolutely crucial, and early diagnosis and treatment can really make a huge difference. So the purpose of today's episode isn't to tell you to replace medication with nutrition. It's about understanding the bigger picture. It's about asking why the immune system may have become dysregulated in the first place, and what lifestyle, nutrition, and gut health strategies might help support your body alongside the care you're already receiving. Because if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you'll know that's always the question that I'm interested in, not simply what's the diagnosis. And to be honest, for some conditions, the diagnosis doesn't matter as much to me, but why has this happened? And perhaps more importantly, what can we do about it? And the functional tests that I run are not tests to diagnose a condition. They are there to give us insights of underlying imbalances that we can address with lifestyle and nutrition. Today, we're going to talk about the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, the latest research into the gut microbiome, why your mouth might be just as important as your joints when it comes to arthritis, and most importantly, what practical things you can start doing to support your health today. So let's begin with the basics in case you didn't listen to the first episode that I did on rheumatoid arthritis, because people often confuse rheumatoid arthritis with osteoarthritis, but they're actually very different conditions. Osteoarthritis is largely considered a mechanical condition, although there certainly are inflammatory aspects to it, and it tends to develop over time as cartilage wears down through age, previous injuries, or repetitive strain. And I worked with clients of varying ages who have osteoarthritis. And whilst inflammation certainly plays a role, it isn't primarily driven by the immune system. Whereas with rheumatoid arthritis, it is an autoimmune disease. And that means the immune system, whose job is to normally protect us from infections, starts recognizing our own tissue, so that tissue in the joint, as foreign. In rheumatoid arthritis, the main target is something called the synovium, and this is the delicate lining that surrounds our joint, and it produces the lubricating fluid that allows them to move smoothly. Instead of leaving this tissue alone, the immune system begins to target it. Immune cells then move into the joint, and you have these inflammatory chemicals are released, and the blood vessels become more permeable, lining thickens, and swelling can develop. And over time, inflammation can begin damaging cartilage, it can damage tendons, and even the bone itself, which is why it's so important to be proactive with this type of condition. And it feels a lot different to other joint conditions. And people don't simply describe pain, they can describe heat, stiffness and swelling, exhaustion, and sometimes they tell me they feel as if they have the flu every single day. And I know I experienced this when I had chronic fatigue syndrome. And one of the things I think is really important to understand is that rheumatoid arthritis isn't just a disease of the joints, it's a disease of the immune system. And when I was living with alopecia, people would focus so much on the hair. It's the immune system that's dysfunctional in a lot of these conditions, and that's what we need to address. And because your immune system travels throughout your body, rheumatoid arthritis can affect many different organs. It can actually increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, it can affect the lungs, it can contribute to osteoporosis as well. And I work with clients with both osteoarthritis and osteoporosis. It can influence the eyes, it can cause dryness and inflammation, it can affect energy production, and one of the main symptoms I see in my clients with arthritis is fatigue as well. And in clinic, one of the things I hear most often isn't actually my joints hurt, it's I'm just so tired and I can't really do anything, or I have weakness in my legs, or I have weakness in my body. And the fatigue can sometimes be one of the earliest symptoms people experience long before there is significant damage to the joints. And that's why it is so vital to be connected to your body, to listen to your body, to listen to the symptoms rather than trying to suppress them, because your body is telling you something, and that's why we need to listen. And there are many symptoms that people overlook when it comes to arthritis. When people imagine rheumatoid arthritis, they picture severely swollen hands, and yes, I do see that. But whilst that certainly can happen, the condition often begins much more subtly. Perhaps you wake up in the morning and your fingers feel stiff for an hour or more. You might be waking up and your feet ache when you first stand up. I've experienced a lot of these, and I was never actually diagnosed with arthritis. But looking back, I had the stiffness in my hands, I had the pain in my feet. You might have issues opening jars because you have weakness around your wrists and your hands. You might notice that your wedding rings feel tighter, and that is often the feedback I get when I'm working with a client, that they're then able to get their rings back on when they start to feel better. You might struggle to make a fist and, clench your fist. You might find yourself avoiding certain movement because your wrists simply don't feel strong enough to use them. And I loved Pilates, but there were times when I was having flares and I just couldn't do those weight-bearing exercises. I honestly just thought that was the way my body was and I wasn't going to get any better. And I just feel so much stronger now when I'm doing a plank or I'm doing a press up. I can actually use my wrists again. So it just shows that once you get to the root cause, the symptoms for many people can be reversible. But one of the hallmark features of rheumatoid arthritis is the stiffness that tends to improve with movements. And that's one of the ways it differs from mechanical joint problems, where movement often makes things worse. Rheumatoid arthritis also tends to affect both sides of the body in a fairly symmetrical way. So if your left wrist is affected, there's a reasonable chance that your right wrist will be affected too. But alongside those joint symptoms are the ones that often receive far less attention, and those are symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, you might have poor concentration, low mood, just this generalized aching, this dull ache all over your body. And some people even lose weight unintentionally before they receive a diagnosis. And the reason I want to spend a little time talking about these symptoms is because they remind us that rheumatoid arthritis isn't simply happening inside one joint. Something much bigger is taking place within the immune system, which brings us to one of the biggest shifts in our understanding over the last few years, and it's could rheumatoid arthritis actually begin outside the joint? And this is probably the area of research that fascinates me the most. And for decades, researchers focused almost entirely on the joints themselves, which makes sense to get an understanding of the condition, but increasingly evidence suggests that the immune dysfunction behind rheumatoid arthritis may actually begin many years before joint symptoms appear. In fact, research now talk about what they call the mucosal origins hypothesis. All it really means is that rather than rheumatoid arthritis starting in the joints, it may begin in places where the immune system constantly meets the outside world, like the gut. You might not think of the gut as being exposed to the outside world, but it is a hollow area. It might be in the mouth or even in the lungs. And when you think about it, this makes perfect sense because your digestive tract is exposed to foods every single day and trillions of bacteria live there. Viruses pass through your gut, environmental chemicals pass through your gut. Your immune system has to make millions of decisions every day based on what it's exposed to. And those decisions are whether those bacteria or the food is friend or foe, and should your immune system tolerate this or should it attack it? Does your immune system see it as a risk to your survival? And most of the time that process works beautifully. The immune system learns to tolerate foods as you eat them. It coexists peacefully with the beneficial bacteria that you have in the gut, and it responds appropriately when there is a genuine threat like a virus or an infection. It's an incredibly sophisticated system. I loved learning about the immune system when I was at university and studying immunology. I consider myself an immunologist. I just find the whole area of immunology really fascinating, and there is still immune cells being discovered today. But what happens if that communication starts to break down? What happens if the barrier separating your gut from the rest of your body becomes damaged and then is able to allow more particles through and the immune system isn't able to do the job that it's designed to do? It's good to imagine your gut lining as the walls surrounding a castle, because those walls aren't there to keep everything out, are they? They're there to decide what is allowed through. For example, nutrients are welcome. Water is welcome, certain compounds are transported carefully across, and everything else should remain outside until it's ready. Now imagine parts of those walls beginning to develop cracks. Suddenly, some substances that normally remain safely inside the digestive tract can come into much closer contact with the immune system. Again, that doesn't mean that everyone with increased intestinal permeability will develop rheumatoid arthritis. Far from it, because there are so many people living with leaky gut today. But if somebody already has a genetic susceptibility, perhaps they've experienced significant stress, maybe they've had repeated courses of antibiotics, perhaps they're a smoker, or they've developed periodontal disease, those additional immune triggers may start adding up. And rather than one dramatic event causing rheumatoid arthritis, we may instead see that the immune system gradually loses tolerance over many years. And I think that's such an empowering way to look at autoimmune disease, because it reminds us that whilst we can't change our genetics, there are many other pieces of the puzzle that we may be able to influence. And one of the biggest of those is the gut microbiome. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about next, because some of the research that has emerged over the last few years is genuinely fascinating. So let's dive into the gut microbiome, because if you have followed my work, you'll know that this is an area that I come back to time and time again. Not because I think the gut is responsible for everything, but because it's one of the most important places where our immune system learns what to respond to and equally important, what to ignore. When people hear the word microbiome, they often think of probiotics or fermented foods, but in reality, the microbiome is far more complex than that. It's an entire ecosystem made up of trillions of bacteria, fungi, viruses, and other microorganisms that live predominantly in our digestive tract. In fact, there are more microbial cells living in and on our bodies than human cells. And these microbes aren't just passive passengers. They help digest fibers that we break down ourselves. They produce vitamins. They create anti-inflammatory compounds called short-chain fatty acids. They communicate with our nervous system. They can influence our hormone metabolism. And perhaps most importantly in today's discussion, they help educate and regulate our immune system. And one of the things I often say to clients is that the immune system is a little bit like a highly trained security team. Its job isn't to attack everything that comes through the door. In fact, that would be disastrous. You could imagine this as an airport security trying to just arrest everybody that goes through. That's not what's going to happen. The real skill lies in recognizing what is safe and what genuinely represents a threat. And our gut bacteria play a remarkable role in helping to train that security team, because when the microbiome is diverse and healthy, it helps reinforce those messages of tolerance, and that encourages the development of these specialized immune cells called regulatory T cells, which are one of the most significant immune cells when it comes to an autoimmune disease, and you might hear them called Tregs as well. You don't need to remember that name, but these cells are incredibly important because one of their jobs is to calm the immune system down when overreacting. They're like the peacemakers of the immune system, and when I'm working with clients and I can see that there is this inflammatory response happening in the body, then I am recommending nutrients that are going to help to produce T regulatory cells. Even something like vitamin D is really important for T regulatory cells. A test that I've been using quite a lot at the moment actually is an immune profile, and you can actually test these different cells, so your B cells and your T cells and your T regulatory cells, and it gives you such good insight into what is driving that autoimmune response. And if you pair that with a food sensitivity test or a pathogen reactivity test, you can really drill down into what the underlying root cause is. And I've just found it so helpful when I've been working with more complex cases. However, if the microbiome becomes less diverse or starts to lose some of its beneficial bacteria, those calming signals can begin to diminish, and instead the immune system might receive more inflammatory messages, making it easier for chronic inflammation to become established. So what does the latest research tell us? Well, one of the bacteria that has received enormous attention over the last decade is Prevotella. And if you've listened to my previous rheumatoid arthritis episode, you may remember me mentioning it before. And since then, the evidence has continued to grow because researchers have repeatedly found that people with newly diagnosed rheumatoid arthritis are more likely to have increased levels of Prevotella in their gut compared with healthy individuals. Here's a really important point. I don't want anyone listening to come away thinking Prevotella is simply a bad bacterium that needs eliminating, and as we all know, biology rarely works like that. In fact, many bacteria behave differently depending on the environment they're living in. We can think of them like people. Someone who is perfectly pleasant and in a balanced community may behave very different if all the usual checks and balances disappear. And what's becoming increasingly clear is that it's not one single bacterium causing rheumatoid arthritis. Instead, we're seeing an entire ecosystem that has changed. Diversity often increases, and those protective organisms become less abundant, and those inflammatory pathways as a result become more active. It's the balance that's shifted, and I often use the analogy of a garden when I'm describing this, because if you have a beautiful, well-maintained garden with flowers, with trees, with wildlife all living together, then everything is in perfect harmony. But if you imagine one species of weed begins taking over, the problem isn't necessarily the weed itself. The reason it's able to spread is because the rest of the garden is no longer thriving. And that's very similar to what we're seeing within the gut microbiome. Interestingly, while some bacteria become much less abundant in those with rheumatoid arthritis, and one of my favorites to talk about is Akkermansia, which is having its moment. And if you've followed my social media recently, you'll know I've mentioned this bacterium quite a lot because it's becoming increasingly recognized for its role in maintaining the gut lining, but also helping with blood sugar regulation. And it lives within that mucus layer that coats the intestine. And at first that sounds rather alarming. People often ask me, surely we don't want bacteria eating our mucus, but it's actually rather clever, as Akkermansia feeds on old mucus and it stimulates the body to produce fresh, healthy mucus. It's a bit like pruning a plant. By removing the old growth, you encourage healthy new growth. And that mucus layer is incredibly important because it's one of the first protective barriers separating those trillions of bacteria inside the gut from the immune cells sitting just beneath it. And when that layer becomes thinner or compromised, communication between the microbiome and the immune system changes. And another group of bacteria I pay close attention to are those butyrate-producing bacteria. Now, butyrate is one of the most fascinating compounds produced inside our gut, and it's tested for in the GIFX stool test that I offer to my clients. And when we eat dietary fibres, particularly from vegetables or legumes, nuts, seeds, and other plant foods, then certain bacteria ferment that fibre and produce short-chain fatty acids, which one of the most important of these is butyrate. And I often describe butyrate as the fertiliser for the cells living in your colon. It provides them with energy, it helps maintain the barrier, it supports immune regulation, and it reduces inflammation. And it even influences the communication between the gut and the brain, which is, again, a fast evolving area of research, and we know how important it is for human health. And it's remarkable that something as simple as feeding the right bacteria can have such widespread effects throughout the body. Now, one of the questions I'm often asked is, how does the microbiome become disrupted in the first place? And unfortunately, there's no one simple answer, because repeated courses of antibiotics can certainly affect the microbiome, although sometimes they're absolutely necessary and life-saving, of course. Food poisoning and gastrointestinal infections can change microbial communities for months and sometimes years. I might work with a client and they may have had a bout of food poisoning when they were on holiday 10 years ago and it's still affecting them. It can also be a diet lower in fibre and variety, which means beneficial bacteria have less fuel available. It could be due to a period of chronic stress or just living in chronic stress, which can change gut mobility, digestion secretions, and the composition of the microbiome. It might relate to poor sleep, which can reduce microbial diversity. And smoking remains one of the strongest environmental risk factors for rheumatoid arthritis and appears to influence both the microbiome and immune function. And then, of course, there are all the other factors that I talk about regularly on this podcast, including environmental toxins, alcohol, and highly processed diets. And none of these factors alone cause rheumatoid arthritis, but they gradually shift the environment in a direction that makes immune dysregulation more likely. Now let's move further up the digestive tract, because one of the most exciting developments in recent years has been our growing understanding of what's known as the oral gut axis. When we think about digestion, we often jump straight to the stomach or intestines, but digestion actually begins in the mouth, and every single day we swallow over a litre of saliva along with millions of oral bacteria. And those bacteria don't simply disappear. Many of them travel into the digestive tract where they interact with the existing gut microbiome. Researchers have become particularly interested in periodontal disease or advanced gum disease. And one bacteria that continues to receive attention, and you can test for this as well, is Porphyromonas gingivalis. Now, this bacterium is fascinating because it produces an enzyme capable of altering proteins through a process called citrullination. And you don't need to remember that word, of course, but it is important because one of the hallmark antibodies found in rheumatoid arthritis actually targets citrullinated proteins. And researchers believe that this may be one of the ways the immune system starts recognizing certain proteins. Again, this doesn't mean gum disease causes rheumatoid arthritis, because it's never that simple. What it does tell us is that oral health matters, and bleeding gums aren't normal. Persistent bad breath isn't normal. Loose teeth aren't normal. And if your gums bleed every time you brush your teeth, your body is giving you information. As clinicians, we sometimes become so focused on stool tests and food diaries that we forget to ask about the mouth, yet chronic inflammation anywhere in the body contributes to the overall inflammatory burden. burden. And this is why I encourage clients not only to brush twice a day, but also floss regularly, clean between the teeth, consider tongue cleaning, and keep up with your dental hygienist appointments. And sometimes improving oral health alone becomes another small piece of reducing overall immune activation. So at this point, you might be thinking, this is fascinating, but what does this actually mean for me? And that's always the question I like to ask, because understanding the science is helpful, but only if it changes what we do. And the first thing I'd focus on is diversity. One of the strongest predictors of a healthy microbiome is diversity. And that doesn't mean eating exotic superfoods. It simply means exposing your gut bacteria to a wide variety of fibers and compounds. A simple goal I often suggest is aiming for around 30 different plant foods each week, or having 3 different colours on your plate and trying to change that with every meal. Before anyone panics, this isn't 30 portions of vegetables every day. We're focusing more on plant-based foods. So herbs count, spices will count, seeds count, nuts count, beans count, and of course different coloured vegetables count individually. And even adding fresh parsley to your dinner is another plant towards that weekly total. I'll always have some herbs in my fridge that I can just throw into quinoa, or I can just throw into a curry, or I can make a sauce for some fish that I'm eating. So it's quite easy to just add that in. And over time, this provides a much broader range of fibres for different bacteria to feed upon. And rather than feeding just one small group of microbes, you're nourishing an entire ecosystem. And that's exactly what we're trying to achieve. Before we move on, I want to address something that comes up almost every week in clinic, and that's diet. Of course, as a nutritionist. And whenever someone is diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, they often will do their own research, and we'll be looking at what foods they should be avoiding if they have rheumatoid arthritis. And they're faced with hundreds of different options. And one person tells them to avoid tomatoes, and then they might decide to eliminate dairy because I've heard it's inflammatory, or gluten. And they might, I've worked with clients who have stopped eating grains because they're worried about the inflammatory component of that. And before long, they're not really eating many foods, but really still not seeing that many results. And if you followed me for a while, you'll know that's not an approach I generally recommend. Can food trigger symptoms in some people? Well, absolutely. And I will recommend clients to remove foods if I think they are problematic. Certain foods can influence inflammation. We know high sugar foods, oxidized fats, these can all promote inflammation in the body. But I don't believe rheumatoid arthritis develops because somebody ate tomatoes, for example, unless they have a specific problem with it. And nor do I think there is one universal diet for rheumatoid arthritis. We are all individuals and we need to work with our own biochemistry. So one of the first things I ask myself when I'm looking at somebody's food diary isn't what should we remove, it's what might be missing. Are they eating enough protein? Often that's not the case. Are they eating enough colourful vegetables? Have they got omega-3 fats in their diet, especially if they don't like fish? Have they got enough minerals, fibre, healthy fats? Because sometimes we become so focused on what we're taking away that we forget that the immune system also needs the right building blocks to function properly. After all, every immune cell, every enzyme, every antibody, every tissue repair process relies on nutrients. If those nutrients are missing, the body has a much harder job. And one nutrient I particularly pay attention to is protein. Our muscles, connective tissue, cartilage, and immune cells all require amino acids. Yet I often meet people who are unintentionally under-eating protein because they're avoiding meat, or they're struggling with their appetite, or they're relying heavily on refined carbohydrates. And rather than obsessing over exact numbers, I usually encourage my clients to include a good source of protein with every meal. And this could be fish, eggs, it could be chicken, lean meats, organ meats, lentils, beans, tofu, or other protein-rich foods. And I particularly like slow-cooked meats as well. And you can get different cuts of meats, and because it's easier for you to digest, especially if you have digestion issues. And alongside protein, I encourage people, of course, to eat the rainbow. And it's not because different coloured vegetables have magical properties, of course, but because each colour contains different polyphenols and plant compounds that nourish different groups of bacteria within the gut. We're always going back to the gut. So think of it as feeding different members of your microbial community, such as purple berries or orange peppers, green herbs, red cabbage, dark leafy greens. Always be thinking about that colour and making sure that you're getting different colours throughout the day. Another area with reasonably consistent evidence is omega-3 fatty acids, and these healthy fats are found in oily fish such as salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring, and anchovies. And you can get anchovies and just eat them as snacks. There's some really lovely ones that you can get in olive oil, and I encourage my clients to eat them as snacks, and they're not as salty when they're in the olive oil either. And I think that's an important distinction, that inflammation isn't the enemy. So we are eating these anti-inflammatory foods, but inflammation is important. If you have an infection or you cut yourself, you need that inflammation. But the problem arises when the inflammation fails to resolve, and that can happen a lot with an autoimmune disease. And that's where these omega-3 fatty acids can be really helpful. They can help to resolve the inflammation. If you don't have them in your diet, then that inflammatory process can continue to be switched on. Now, one thing I've become increasingly passionate about over the last few years is that there is this connection between the nervous system and the immune system. And for a long time, we treated these as though they were completely separate systems. But now we know they're constantly communicating. And if your brain perceives that you're under threat, then your immune system receives that information. That doesn't mean that stress causes rheumatoid arthritis. It's just an underlying issue that can be contributing to your symptoms. And I want to be really careful with my wording here, because I never want anyone to feel blamed for their diagnosis, of course, but chronic stress does influence immune function. We know it affects digestive secretion, it can change your gut motility, it can alter your microbiome, it can influence your sleep and change your hormone production. And all of these things feed into the immune system. Sometimes people will tell me that they feel guilty spending time resting, that they think they should always be doing something productive, and I am guilty of this myself. But when you are recovering, that requires energy, and recovery requires resources. So the body cannot constantly exist in that survival mode. And this is one of the reasons I often talk about vagal tone and the vagus nerve, and simple practices like diaphragmatic breathing, walking outside, humming, singing, meditating, spending time in nature, or just simply eating meals more slowly, all send signals of safety back to the nervous system. And as you know, I have been using the NeuroSim, and when I use it, I just feel this sense of calm. When I use it consistently, I see improvements in my sleep, improvement in my stress levels, because I monitor all this on my Aura ring. If you aren't using one of these types of devices, then I encourage you to explore this. I will put some information about the NeuroSim in the show notes if you want to find out more, but they're not replacing any type of medication. They're there to help you feel calmer in your environment, and it's not to be used in isolation. There are other things that are going to help as well. Sleep is one of the most powerful anti-inflammatory tools we have, and if you've ever had a poor night's sleep, you'll know how different you feel the next day. You can be more sensitive to pain, you might feel more irritable, your concentration might not be as sharp. Imagine if that is happening night after night. Sleep is when much of our repair work takes place, and it's when hormones are balanced, the immune regulation and new immune cells are produced, and our tissues recover. So if somebody tells me they're sleeping 4 or 5 hours every night, I'm far less interested in finding another supplement, because I'm much more interested in understanding why they're not sleeping, and we try to address that first, because once their sleep improves, it can have such a knock-on effect to other areas. Now, let's talk about stool testing, because this is one question I'm asked frequently. And people often say to me, why are we doing a stool test when the problem is in my joints? And the answer is because I'm trying to understand what may be contributing to that immune dysregulation, because as we've discussed, the gut is so linked to the joints, and a comprehensive stool test will give me that information that we simply can't obtain from the symptoms alone. For example, we look at digestive function. Are you producing enough digestive enzymes? Are you digesting fat sufficiently? It also assesses inflammation in the gut. It measures secretory IgA, one of the gut's first line of immune defenses. We evaluate microbial diversity, beneficial bacteria, butyrate, And we look at organisms like Akkermansia, which is really important as well. And we can identify opportunistic organisms that may be contributing to inflammation in those who are susceptible as well. And we can assess short-chain fatty acids, which give us valuable information on how effectively your microbiome is fermenting fibers. And why I love testing is that it allows us to move away from the guesswork instead of assuming that everybody just needs a probiotic. You really need to know your baseline first. It's so vital when it comes to your health that you are working on the issues that you have rather than just taking a probiotic, because 9 times out of 10 when I'm working with clients, they actually have too much commensal bacteria in their gut, which is the bacteria that are part of a probiotic, rather than too little, and it's actually that they have more of an overgrowth. If you listen to today's episode and there's one message that I'd like you to take away, it's this: rheumatoid arthritis is far more than a disease of painful joints. It's a disease involving immune regulation, and our immune system doesn't work in isolation. It's influenced every single day by what's happening in the gut, by the health of the mouth, by the foods we eat, by our sleep, our stress levels, our microbiome, our movement, and our environment. And now none of these things individually explain why somebody develops rheumatoid arthritis, but together they help create the environment in which our immune system operates. And I actually find that incredibly hopeful, because whilst we can't change our genes, we can influence many of the messages that our genes receive, and we can support a healthier microbiome by improving our diet, prioritizing our sleep, looking after our oral health, and importantly, we can stop relying on guesswork and do what's right for our own body. So if you're living with rheumatoid arthritis and you're wondering whether your gut health could be playing a role in your symptoms, this is exactly why I use comprehensive stool testing in clinic. And rather than simply recommending the latest probiotic or another restricted diet, I'd rather understand what's happening inside your unique microbiome and build a plan around that. So if you'd like to find out more about the testing I use, or you'd like to work with me one-to-one, you'll find all the information linked in today's show notes. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review, subscribe to the podcast, or share it with somebody who might benefit from hearing this conversation. I also have a new service where I have just a few appointments over the summer where I will be spending a day with somebody, helping them with their health, really going through everything in detail, and them leaving that session with a 6-month strategy for improving their health. So if you are time short and you would like to meet up in London and work together in a day session, very intensive, but at the same time, you get exactly what you need in that day, then I'll put the link to apply for the Root Reset Intensive over the summer. There's a couple of dates available still. Have a look through that if you're interested. Feel free to message me if you've got any questions. But as always, thank you for listening today. Take care of yourself, take care of your immune system, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the Autoimmune Reset podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Autoimmune Reset. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if you liked it, I would hugely appreciate a review on iTunes, as it helps me understand what you like about the podcast and to help share the information with more people. I'm excited to speak to you next time, and remember, you have the power to take the reins on your health. So keep the faith and celebrate the small wins. Until next time.